Okay, more Bonhoeffer today. Letters and papers from prison. And for some context, in April 1943, Bonhoeffer was arrested by the Gestapo, and for 2 years he sat in Tegel prison, accused of treason for his role in the German resistance against Hitler. So cut off from the world, being in prison, forbidden from teaching and preaching or anything like that, Bonhoeffer began to write letters to his family, to his fiancée, and above all to his friend and student, Eberhard Bethge. Those letters, scribbled on scraps of paper, smuggled out of prison, became one of the most extraordinary theological documents of the 20th century. So this, Letters and Papers from Prison, is in volume 8 of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works in English. And it represents the really mature, daring, and even unsettling climax of his theology. Here, Bonhoeffer speaks really from the edge of death, and imagines a faith for a world come of age, as he calls it. Bonhoeffer had already lived through years of resistance. At Finkenwalde, he was training, pastors for the Confessing Church. And by 1940, he was working with a military intelligence office that really doubled as a cover for anti-Nazi conspiracy. And he expected that he would eventually die, be executed. But imprisonment really transformed him, where discipleship called Christians really to take the form of Christ and not necessarily to sort of engage with the powers of the world. The prison writings push the same form outward into the quote-unquote secular, the ordinary, the world come of age. Okay. And so here Bonhoeffer begins to ask, and you get this from page 362, what is Christianity? Or who is Christ actually for us today? That question becomes the center of his letters and papers from prison. From his cell, Bonhoeffer looks out really at the modern world that seems to have moved beyond religion. Things in scientific advancements, cultural advancements, politics no longer rely on God to explain their existence, really. But instead of lamenting this, he sees it in a kind of strange way as a sign of maturity, humanity coming of age. He writes on page 478, quote, God would have us know that we must live as those who manage our lives without God. God would have us know that we must live as those who manage our lives without God. End quote. This sounds weird, right? But we got to really hear what Bonhoeffer's trying to do. He's not meaning atheism here. It means that God refuses to be a kind of stopgap for human ignorance and weakness. God is actually the one hiding God's self in weakness, vulnerability, and suffering. So Bonhoeffer will go on and say, quote, on the next page, God is weak and powerless in the world. And this is precisely the way, the only way, in which he will help us, in which he is with us, end quote, okay? For Bonhoeffer, this is not the end of faith, it's its purification. Faith no longer means escaping from the world for the sacred or something like that. It means discovering God at the center, right in the center of the mundane, the secular, if you want to call it that. Right there, the crucified God who bears the world in silence. Okay. In several letters to Bethge, Bonhoeffer begins to use a provocative phrase, religionless Christianity. And this comes from 362, quote, what keeps gnawing at me is this question. What Christianity really is, or indeed who Christ really is for us today. The time when people could be told everything by means of words, whether theological or pious, is over, end quote. So by religion, what Bonhoeffer is talking about, he's not talking about faith itself. He means the kind of cultural system or systems that use God as an explanation or a kind of crutch or even a boundary marker. Okay. A religionless Christianity, or even national boundary markers, I think, to justify sort of national boundary markers. This is the closest that he gets to kind of breaking from his previous, really kind of like internationalism that kind of floats through, especially his ethics. But yeah, a religionless Christianity is one that's going to be stripped of power and privilege, reduced to its center, really, which is the crucified Christ who exists for others. So Bonhoeffer imagines a church that lives without the safety of religion, a community that serves, suffers, and loves without seeking reward. So from 503, quote, "The church is the church only when it exists for others." Links hands right with what he does with freedom, right? We saw this in the last video. Freedom is freedom for the other, okay? So this radical simplicity, Christ existing as love for the world, is the culmination of everything Bonhoeffer ever wrote, really. Now, it's important to recognize that Bonhoeffer's idea of religionless Christianity is far more radical and unsettling than it's often portrayed, especially in popular kind of presentations of Bonhoeffer. Writers like Eric Metaxas, for example, whose biography helped, I don't know if helped, but it attempted to help introduce Bonhoeffer to popular audiences. It tends to domesticate this vision of religionless Christianity, treating the prison writings in general as an inspiring story of personal faith and moral courage and stuff like that. And of course, it kind of is that, right? But Bonhoeffer's theological project here is far more explosive than that. When he speaks of a world come of age, he isn't suggesting a renewal of conventional Christianity, or like a revival or something like that, or a call to defend faith's cultural influence. He's announcing the end of religion as a form of human power and control, its collapse into the weakness of God revealed on the cross. So to live without religion or religionless is not about abandoning Christ. It's actually the exact opposite. It's to follow him into the God-forsaken spaces where religion can no longer speak. Bonhoeffer's letters then aren't about preserving something like a Christian identity. They're about surrendering to it so that Christ alone remains, the God who refuses to be used, possessed, or defended. So from 478, quote, "God would have us know that we must live as those who manage our lives without God." Again, this is what he's getting at. The line doesn't signal unbelief. It's the revelation of divine humility. The God who withdraws from power is the same God who enters history as love. And that, Bonhoeffer insists, is where true discipleship begins, right? So, world come of age. I've used that a couple times. Bonhoeffer sees the modern world as this, it's coming of age. Humanity no longer living in fear of divine intervention in some sort of explosively, like, potentially terrifying way, or of priestly control on the ground. Most theologians in this time saw this as a threat to them and their assumptions about the church, Christianity, God, all of that. Bonhoeffer sees it as an opportunity here. So from 469, quote, "We are to find God in what we know, not in what we don't know," end quote. If the world has kind of grown up and matured, the church must also grow up and mature, no longer imposing religion on the world, but serving it, bearing its burdens, participating in its life. So Bonhoeffer's tone here is both hopeful and somewhat tragic. He envisions a new kind of faith that doesn't retreat from modernity, but inhabits it as the presence of Christ in that world. This is really the extension of his discipleship theology, right? There, in that what we talked about in the last video, Christ takes form in the community of believers. Here, in Letters and Papers, Christ's form expands into the world, hidden, suffering, and redemptive, okay? Throughout these letters, Bonhoeffer returns to the Apostle Paul's claim in 2 Corinthians 12, quote, "My power is made perfect in weakness." So Bonhoeffer writes on page 479, quote, Only the suffering God can help us. That line, simple, devastating, became one of the most famous sentences in modern theology. You may have heard it. For Bonhoeffer, the omnipotent God of classical metaphysics dies on the cross. What remains is the God who consents to powerlessness, the God who bears human suffering from within. This transforms everything. Okay? Faith is no longer belief in divine rescue. It's participation in divine vulnerability now. Discipleship is no longer withdrawal from the world, but immersion into it and into its wounds. Okay? This is why the church has to suffer in the world for Bonhoeffer, because Christ suffered. It's not like you're going around looking for suffering, but it's gonna happen if we're actually, being conformed to this person. Because Christ himself is present there, hidden in the faces of the oppressed, the weak, and the crucified. Okay. As Bonhoeffer really reflects on his own life, his failures, his love for Maria, his longing for friendship, his theology becomes deeply incarnational. He begins to speak of a this worldliness that is not opposed to God, but grounded in God's own incarnation. So from page 46, quote, "It is only by living completely in this world that one learns to have faith. By this worldliness, I mean living unreservedly in life's duties, problems, successes, and failures. In so doing, we throw ourselves completely into the arms of God." End quote. For him, Jesus Christ is the ultimate, quote unquote, human for others. To be Christian is to share that same form, to be open, vulnerable, and self-giving. So in 480, quote, "In Christ we are called to share in God's sufferings at the hands of a godless world," end quote. So it's striking that even in prison, amid deprivation and despair, Bonhoeffer's thought becomes more human, becomes more embodied, and in some sense, more joyful and hopeful. It's kind of the last thing you would expect, someone who doesn't know if they're going to live or die. Okay. Bonhoeffer's letters look forward to a new kind of church, one that is really shed of clericalism, privilege, and dogmatic certainty. It will be, as he writes on page 503, quote, "a church of the powerless and the suffering." Such a church doesn't seek domination. It seeks presence. It doesn't stand above the world, but alongside it, praying, working, and serving. It exists only insofar as it is for others. Here we see the final evolution of his lifelong theme of representation in his thinking. The notion that Christ stands in our place for us, and we in turn stand in the place of others. It's the concrete expression of the form of Christ that began in discipleship, right? The cruciform shape of the church is now turned outward, an incarnate presence in the secular world. Okay. So in April of 1945, Bonhoeffer was indeed executed in a concentration camp, just days before the Allied forces liberated that particular camp. A witness reported that he prayed quietly, and then possibly said something like, "This is the end for me, the beginning of life." His prison letters end not in despair, though, but in eschatological hope. The final fragments hint at a vision of the world fully reconciled in Christ, a world where God's hidden presence and weakness is finally revealed as love's power. So, quote from 486, "We are to live in the light of the resurrection, but not before the cross." Okay. His life and death become the embodiment of his own theology: religionless Christianity, faith without privilege, hope without illusions, Christ existing as community in a world come of age. So just to conclude here, why does letters and papers from prison still matter? I think it's because Bonhoeffer teaches us that death, the death of religion, can be the rebirth of a new kind of faith, never adjusting kind of faith. He shows us a God who refuses to dominate, but instead suffer within the world. And he calls us to follow Christ not into an escape, right, but into an engaged, worldly kind of holiness, to find God in the center of life, in the neighbor, in acts of love. Okay, so from page 479, quote, "The church is the church only when it exists for others," right? And as we've already quoted as well, only the suffering God can help. So Bonhoeffer's prison letters are not the record of a person who lost faith by any means. They are the words of a man whose faith became fully human. And in that humanity, he saw the very face of Christ, I think. So just to conclude here, from 46, quote, "It is only by living completely in this world that one learns to have faith," okay? So that's Bonhoeffer's letters and papers from prison. With that, this has been Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can.